Culture in the direct method, the notion of realia, and the emergence of a cultural approach in second language education. The second famous second language teaching methodology of the 19th century is the direct method or the natural method. The direct method arose in the second half of the century to a large extent as a reaction against the grammar translation method. Numerous supporters of the direct method criticized the grammar translation approach for its excessive literature centrism, excessive focus on translation and grammar, and especially for the little attention paid to usage of the second language in oral communication. Essential skills determine people's proficiency in a second language. The direct method was a dominating approach to second language teaching in Europe and the United States between the 1880s and the 1920s. It was so influential that it inspired a movement to reform modern language teaching around the world. This movement is known under the name of the Reform Movement in England and the USA, and Neuere Richtung in Germany. However, the direct method is not limited to this specific period. The ideas of the direct approach were expressed before the 1880s, and its impact on second language education goes far beyond the 1920s. If the grammar translation method is known as a method with no theory, the direct method has a solid theoretical background. It has been developed in dozens of monographs and hundreds of articles, published mostly in German, English, French, and Scandinavian languages. Unfortunately, the next generation of second language educators have almost forgotten these publications. We can find many of them on archives.org, an online library of vintage literature, including second language textbooks and literature on second language methodology. Based on this vast literature, we can summarize the basic principles of the direct method. According to the direct method, modern languages should be taught differently than ancient classic languages. The teaching methodology should be placed upon the language, not literature. Also, the methodology of second language teaching should be oriented towards a natural order in which a child learns her mother tongue. That is, through oral communication with adults that takes place in real life context without any other language's interference. A child learns how to understand and speak first, and then how to read and write. This orientation to natural second language learning entailed the following pedagogical applications. First, second language learners must learn the language, not about the language. Second language grammar should not be the final objective of language learning. Second, speaking should be prioritized as the most important skill. Oral communication skills should be taught by question and answer exchanges between the teacher and learners. All new learning points should be introduced orally through these exchanges. Translation into the first language should be limited to a minimum. Whole sentences should be taught from the very beginning instead of memorizing separate words. The vocabulary should be taught through Realia. That means that to present new vocabulary and concepts, the teacher should use the surrounding environment, demonstration, pantomiming, real-life object, and visual materials such as pictures and maps. To learn spoken languages, The preliminary study of grammar is unnecessary. Grammar is learned inductively by generalizing from examples learned orally. Therefore, the linguistic partners to be taught must be carefully selected based on its difficulty, usefulness, as well as students' needs, proficiency level, and previous knowledge. Most useful is always taught first, so that the student's mind is not encumbered with rules and words form that he cannot immediately use and will forget again before needing them. Self-correction of errors is encouraged. And finally, since the direct method focuses on speaking, the pronunciation becomes very important. The proponent of the direct method emphasize the explicit teaching of second language pronunciation. For that purpose, they recommended to use, among others, the International Phonetic Alphabet. By the way, the second language education of the end of the 19th century was largely inspired by the advances in phonetics. In 1886, a group of French and British language teachers, led by the French linguist Paul Passy, formed the International Phonetic Association. 2 years later, the association developed an international phonetic alphabet and advocated for using it to teach pronunciation in second language classrooms. The obsession with phonetics was so intense among the proponents of the direct method that in Germany, for example, many advocates of the Neuere Richtung strongly recommended not letting learners see their ordinary spelling during the first few weeks or months of second language learning. Instead, they recommended beginning with a phonetic transcription of foreign texts so that learners could master the pronunciation first. Now we know the direct method focuses on oral communication and renounces the extreme literary-centrism as practiced within the grammar translation method. Does that mean that culture is banned from the direct second language classroom? Not at all. On the contrary, once turned to systematic teaching real-life language in real-life context, second language education realized the importance of systematic teaching of real-life everyday culture, that is, all multiple cultural aspects covered by the notion of small c culture. These multiple cultural aspects define the context in which a real-life communication occurs. Teaching various cultural aspects, not only literature, supports teaching language as a mean of communication. That was the core idea of Karl Breuil, one of the famous proponents of the direct method and professor of German and French at the University of Cambridge. Breuil expressed his idea about culture in second language classrooms in his seminal book, The Teaching of Modern Foreign Languages and the Training of Teachers, published in 1898. Like all theoreticians of the direct method, Karl Breuil agrees that reading literature masterpieces is still very important for second language education because they provide access to the national spirit. However, he suggests teaching literature only to students of more advanced level of proficiency. I quote, "It is true that the study of Molière's Misanthrope doesn't always help us to read the advertisement of Le Petit Journal, but teachers have no right to withhold from their more advanced pupils the knowledge of some of the greatest work of modern literary art, works full of beauty and of noble ideas expressed in exquisite language." According to Breuil, culture is not limited to literature. He argues that from the very beginning, the reading should be connected with the history and geography of the foreign countries. That is where the hierarchical model of cultural aspects, from Dorfkenkunde, small C culture, to Gretchenkunde, the big C culture, begins to emerge. Some aspects of culture, such as literary masterpieces, are suggested for learners of higher proficiency levels, while others, such as historical and geographical aspects, are suggested for beginner levels. Another second language educator, the professor of German and French at the University of Chicago, Paul Kern, reflected in the same vein on the role of culture in second language education. He argues that the study of classical literature has a place because it is the best reflector of the culture of a nation, but although not the only one. Literature is only a very small part of national life and history. I quote, German literature teaches many good things, but German literature is only a part of the German nation. In addition to linguistic training, Kern suggests practicing the reading, which has the task of providing the students with a picture of the people, which takes its traits from the geography, history, literature, social, economic, and political life of the foreign people. To name a variety of cultural aspects which should be integrated with second language teaching besides literary works, Karl Breuel introduced the term Realia. We already mentioned it before. According to Breuel, realia are illustrative facts and studies comprising a study of foreign life and thoughts, customs, and institutions at different periods, but mainly those of the present time, to be partly acquired abroad by personal observation and experience. The chief auxiliary studies are history and geography. In the chapter on second language teacher education and competencies, Breuel returns to the definition of realia. I quote, as I have said before, the life and thoughts of the nation, the outlines of its institutions and customs, social relations, history and geography, philosophy and religion are comprised in this general term of realia. Interestingly, and I hope you have noticed that too, Karl Breuer insists that the knowledge of reality is based on the learner's and the teacher's personal observation and experience and can be acquired by traveling abroad. Many proponents of the direct method recommended that not only second language learners but also second language teachers regularly, once in 7 years, spend time abroad. According to them, these stays must become a part of teacher professional development and be paid for by the state. However, according to Breuel, before learners have a chance to travel abroad, the teacher can and should create for them a personal experience of realia, the experience of contact with the target culture directly in second language classrooms. The teacher can bring pieces of foreign culture into the class. How is it possible? That is possible by using artifacts illustrating and explaining culture. These artifacts are also called realia. What artifacts can be used in second language classrooms? Karl Breuer mentions postcard, maps, pictures, paintings, objects, even a cinematograph to show slides and video. He also suggests table of foreign measures, weight and monies, pictures of flag of foreign nations, enumeration of the different social grades and their respective titles, letters of various kinds, typical form of advertisement, notice of birth, engagements, marriages, and deaths, together with a list of the most common abbreviations used in the target language and many other things which can surround learners and provide them with a personal experience of contact with the target culture. Paul Kern in his article Realien in neusprachlichen Unterricht, published in 1905, we mentioned this author and this article earlier, try to systemize cultural aspects that should be taught in second language classrooms besides literature. He developed a repertoire of realia, culture-related topics, and source of visual materials, book, charts, maps, etc., supporting these topics. You can see a fragment of this repertoire. It lists cultural facets to be taught verbally and those to be taught with the help of visual support. We can conclude that realia is an essential concept of the teaching approach promoted by the direct method. The concept was introduced and widely used by the proponents of the direct method to explain the way in which culture is supposed to be integrated into a second language classroom focused on oral communication. The concept of reality turns out to be complex. It has several interrelated meanings. First, realia are facts and studies about second language culture, referring to both big C culture and small c culture. Using a modern typology, we can say that realia include products and practices and even some perspectives without tracing a clear boundary between them. Second, realia are also tools used by the teacher in the second language classroom to explain foreign culture through immersive aesthetic experience, visual, audio, and haptic, the experience of contact with the target culture. And finally, in its narrowest sense, realia refer to material objects helping to teach vocabulary without resorting to translation while conducting oral teacher-learners dialogue. For example, let's see how the definition of realien given by Charles Hansen, the American proponent of the direct method, points out different aspects of this concept. Realien are real things or realities, including everything that illustrates, helps to interpret the life and history of a nation, its institutions, manners, customs, etc. In pedagogy, realien means specifically tools, maps, charts, pictures, models, etc. A typical second language classroom inspired by the direct method is based on the oral question and answer exchange between the teacher and learners. The cultural realia become both the content and facilitators of this exchange. From the dialogues, learners receive information about the target culture, realia in the first sense. At the same time, visual supports, really in the second sense, help teachers explain cultural phenomena. And finally, the object used by the teacher how to converse with students in the target language without resorting to translation, really in the third sense. We can ask ourselves, does this complex notion of realia reflect an object-oriented or subject or learner-oriented approach to teaching culture in the second language classroom? The answer is object-oriented approach. Even though Karl Breuil speaks about realia in terms of the individual experience of learners and teachers, they really remain a collection of cultural facts and artifacts viewed from a touristic perspective. This perspective incites curiosity but at the same time creates distance. The learner is exposed to Realia as a shopper or museum visitor are exposed to items displayed in the window. The touristic perspective by default protects learners from deeply reflecting on the values behind cultural objects and practices and comparing these values with their own ones. Learners' cultural values are not the object of discussion. Neither are values differences, potential tensions, and cultural errors. We must wait until the 1960s before cultural differences, tensions, and errors become in the scope of second language educators. Let's see some examples of integrating Realia in typical second language textbooks based on the direct method. Early textbooks inspired by the direct method often contain only samples of teacher-learner dialogues supposed to be conducted orally in the classroom. An example of such typical dialogue is quoted by Breuil. By communicating orally with learners, the teacher introduces geographical realities by showing them on a map. At the same time, the teacher introduces language patterns, allowing the students to say in German, this is Germany, Germany is a country, this is a river, the river flows into the sea, etc. The teacher-learner's communication in the form of oral dialogue creates an opportunity for learners to practice their new knowledge by immediately answering the teacher's questions. So as we can see, using the direct method requires a lot of enthusiasm, creativity, and energy from the teacher, and from learners it requires deep involvement, active participation, and sometimes physical response. Unlike grammar translation-based textbooks, most of those inspired by the direct method have a structure that is aligned with the topics of conversation, not with the grammar presented in each unit. In his book, L'art d'enseigner et d'étudier les langues, The Art of Teaching and Learning Languages, François Gouin, French educator, proposed to organize the teaching of living languages around centres d'intérêt, points of interest, without grammar and translation. The French second language textbook by Lambert Sauveur, Causeries avec mes élèves, Talks with My Students, published in 1884, illustrates that approach. Sauveur's book is divided into chapters named after the topic of the teacher-learner's dialogue. All these topics are related to French cultures, the small c or the big C one. The teacher and learners discuss body parts, really in the classroom, meals and animals. In the simple French language, they speak about the famous French poet La Fontaine, read and discuss some of his fables, converse on the aesthetic category, the sublime, based on the definition given by the French philosopher Blaise Pascal, discuss the differences between prose and verse in French poetry. They also converse on the notion of motherhood in connection with the personality of Jeanne d'Arc. They even have a metacognitive discussion on the principles of the direct method. In the chapter Montaigne, the teacher suggests discussing a fragment from Montaigne's essay, where the French philosopher talks about the natural way he learned Latin by answering orally to the questions asked by his Latin teacher, entirely like the students in Mr. Sauveur's French class. You can see an example of the unit about meals. and the unit where students and the teacher discuss La Fontaine's famous fable, The Raven and the Fox, Le Corbeau et le Renard. Later textbooks inspired by the direct method keep this topic-oriented structure but try to combine it with grammar explanation in the form of footnote comments or separate units. We can find this hybrid structure in the French second language textbook by Maximilien Berlitz. By the way, Maximilien Berlitz is the founder of the famous international language school named after him. Until today, Berlitz School and methodologically closed Lingua International Language School based in Switzerland keep successfully applying the principles of the direct method. The table of contents of Berlitz's book refers to both the grammar and the topics of the dialogue each unit focuses on. Each unit starts with a dialogue we can practice in a real-life situation, such as renting an apartment or visiting a tailor's shop. The grammar and vocabulary are briefly explained in footnote comments or at the beginning of each unit. A conversational exercise follows every dialogue. This exercise suggests questions that make learners engage in a conversation about themselves and check their understanding of the verbal and nonverbal behavior expected in the real life situation presented in the dialogue. For example, the dialogue on renting an apartment is followed by the questions such as, why do we ring the doorbell before coming in? Name different stores of a building. What do you say if you want to invite someone in? What question would you employ to know the number of rooms in the apartment to rent? Is your home covered by insurance? Using modern terminology, we could call Berlitz's textbook a communication-oriented one. The direct method and associated reform movement reached its apogee in the early 20th century. However, despite all the enthusiasm in many countries, the direct method fell into decline by the 1920s. The main reason for that is that the method was very difficult to implement in national school systems in classes of 30-40 students. The method required high professional competency, ability, enthusiasm, and energy from second language teachers. In addition, some linguists of the time, for example Otto Jespersen, criticized the skeptical attitude of the direct method regarding the explicit teaching of grammar and the usage of the student's mother tongue. And finally, the direct method has been challenged for its non-democratic orientation. By promoting oral communication, the method prepared learners for traveling abroad and communicating with foreigners. That was not of intention or capacity for many learners of public schools. The direct method has been replaced by so-called eclectic method, also known as méthode active, active method in French academic tradition. The eclectic method sought to combine different principles from the direct and grammar translation approaches, which could enhance second language acquisition in adult learners. Despite its decline, Christian Purin, French historian of second language education, rightly called the direct method a real historical matrix for the following methodology. In the history of second language education, we will often observe the return of the principles advanced within the direct method, specifically the oral approach to teaching second language. The portal approach will be back in the 1950s, 60s under the name of the audiolingual method. In the 1980s, 90s, within the natural approach, which influenced the communicative teaching paradigm. And finally, in the 2000s, 2010s, within the neuro-linguistic approach. In addition to its important role in language teaching methodology, the direct method has played an even more essential role in the development of second culture teaching. Summarizing the results of the direct method era, Christian Purin considers the 1920s as a paradigm turn, cultural turn in second language education. The major characteristic of this turn is the emergence of a cultural approach culturelle. By cultural approach, Christian Purin understands a systematic integration of culture in second language classrooms, curricula, and textbooks. What exactly do we owe to the direct method in terms of establishment of the cultural approach? Let's summarize that. The great methodological breakthrough of the direct method was recognizing language teaching and learning as an autonomous field focused on language as a mean of oral communication and requiring its own teaching approach based on theoretical principles. These principles have been found in the natural language acquisition by children through oral question and answer based exchanges with adults in real life situations. The direct consequence of this methodological breakthrough was that the direct method allowed second language educators to get rid of spontaneously by default association between language learning and literature or history, and thus opened the door for further questioning on the place of culture in second language classrooms oriented towards oral communication. This questioning resulted in a claim for systematic integration of cultural elements into second language classroom curricula and textbooks. This integration was based on the societal, national, and travelers-oriented conception of foreign culture. Within this conception, culture is understood as various manifestations of a national spirit, including elements of the big C and the small c cultures. And finally, under the strong influence of the direct method, new standards of second language lessons, curricula, and textbooks have been developed in second language education. According to these standards, culture should be systematically integrated into language teaching and even become an organizing principle of second language teaching and learning process. In keeping with the cultural approach, each learning unit must now be constructed from one document, a text, or a dialogue, referring to a specific cultural topic, often related to a specific everyday situation. This document serves as a support for other pedagogical aspects, such as grammar, vocabulary, and culture learning. Even though the influence of the grammar translation techniques will remain very strong in second language classrooms, no one author or publishing house will dare anymore to suggest a second language textbook entirely built on grammar with no systematic attention paid to a cultural component. Also, thanks to the direct method, the principles of teaching culture in second language classrooms through Realia, artifacts presenting and explaining the target culture, has been forever established in second language education. Realia changed forever the second language classroom and made it like the one we know today. The approach by Realia is still relevant today, even though we prefer to use different terminology, such as authentic material. And finally, the teacher's role became to facilitate, with the help of Realia, the learner's personal experience of meeting with their target culture. The contribution of the direct method in teaching culture become even more evident if we compare how culture was integrated in the grammar translation method and the direct method. First, the grammar translation pedagogy had never an objective to systematically teaching the target culture. The grammar was organizing principle of the teaching learning process and textbooks. The presence of culture-related elements such as literary works, realia-based dialogues, or culture-related written text was not compulsory. Whereas the direct method advanced a claim for a systematic teaching the target culture, culture became an organizing principle for second language lessons, curricula, and textbooks. Second, the grammar translation method involved an excessive yet spontaneous literature centrism. Many textbooks inspired by this approach suggested learning second language through reading and translating literary texts. Whereas, based on the national conception of culture, the direct method extended the concept of culture to include in it a variety of aspects belonging to the small c culture in order to present faithfully the life of a nation. Also, the direct method systematized cultural aspects which should be taught in second language classroom. Therefore, the literature centrism has been moderated by a hierarchical conception of cultural aspect from the small c to the big C culture. And finally, within the grammar translation method, we can observe a spontaneous usage of conversational realia integrated into bilingual dialogue suggested to be learned by heart. The direct method makes from Realia a planned, multifunctional teaching strategy which ensures the systematic integration of culture in second language lessons, curricula, and textbooks.